If you've ever had a project that called for 4 yards of fabric and you only had 3.5 yards of fabric and you thought, this isn't going to work, you may change your mind by the end of this video. I am a fabric yardage penny pincher. If I can find a way to shoehorn my sewing project onto less fabric than the pattern calls for, I will. And this can be a bit of a challenge if you're a fan of vintage fabric like this one or the fabric I used for this dress. You can't usually buy it by the yard, so you have to find a project that works for the amount of fabric that you happen to have. Plus, mid-century and earlier fabrics, particularly dress weight cottons like this one, tend to be only 35 inches wide, sometimes 39 inches wide. That's not very wide. Today I'm going to share some of my favorite cutting and layout tips for how you can maximize your precious vintage fabric to squeeze your project onto less fabric than called for, but they're great tips for being more efficient with your modern fabric too. To give you an idea of how much fabric you might be able to save, let's look at a few examples. Simplicity 4401 is an early 60s pants pattern that I've sewed a bunch. For my size, for 44-inch wide fabric, it calls for 2 yards of fabric. But I cut out a modified version which included extra pieces like a back yoke and patch pockets on only 1.5 yards of the same width fabric, saving a half a yard. Simplicity 1727, view 3, calls for 1 3/8 54-inch wide fabric for my size. I sewed this top here in this channel. I'll pop that video link in the description. And I challenged myself and sewed this with only 1 yard of fabric, and I was able to squeeze it in, including making bias tape. And here's Simplicity 2465, this 1940s dress pattern that I sewed with an even longer hemline, making this a maxi dress. For my size, it called for 4 yards of fabric for 35-inch wide fabric. And I used 35-inch wide vintage fabric too, and managed to get it on only 3 1/3 yards. So I shaved off 2/3 of a yard while lengthening the dress. And that video is on the channel too, by the way. Ready to try to shave off 3/8 of a yard of fabric or more? Here's where you start. First, look at your pattern to get a feel for the yardage requirements provided. If you're using a vintage pattern and vintage fabric, you'll see the narrower vintage fabric widths, like 35 inches, listed. But it's okay if you're using a modern pattern or modern fabric, of course. You'll just want to pick the fabric width on the envelope that's closest to what you have. This is really just our initial reference point. But let's say you have 35-inch wide vintage fabric and a vintage pattern. And for this, say I was sewing a size 18. For the pants, the yardage I would need for a size 18 for 35-inch wide fabric is 2 3/8 yards. But what if you've graded the pattern up so you don't know where your starting point is? Say you've graded it up 4 inches at the waist from a 30-inch waist to a 34-inch waist. The waist increases on the patterns roughly 2 inches between sizes, so you've basically graded it up 2 sizes. I would look down from the size that I graded up from and see how much the yardage changes between sizes. So if an 18 calls for 2 3/8 fabric, the 14 also calls for 2 3/8. But look, a junior size 9, which is only a 23.5-inch waist, at 2 1/4 yards of fabric, up to a Mrs. size 18, a 30-inch waist is really only 1/8 of a yard difference. So I would guess that the graded up 2 sizes version might require at most 1/4 of a yard more fabric. And if I had wider fabric, like 44 inches or 54 inches or 56 inches, I'd look to see if that wider fabric width was shown and try to estimate based on that. Vintage patterns like this will sometimes go from a 35 or 36, sometimes 39 inches, sometimes they'll have a 44 inches, and then often a 54 inches as well. So if it doesn't show a 44-inch wide fabric and that's what you have, you can kind of split the difference between the narrower fabric and the wider fabric. Now say that I know my pattern calls for 2 3/8 yards of fabric for my size, and I only have 2 yards of fabric of the same width, or maybe even 1 3/4 yards. I would definitely feel comfortable trying to fit my pattern pieces with the tips we'll talk about. I'll personally try anything from a half yard down for smaller projects like tops and pants, and up to a yard or so down for dresses. Meaning if my dress pattern calls for 4 yards of fabric and I only have 3, I'll try and see if I can get it to fit. Or maybe I have 4 yards, but I don't want to waste any more fabric than I need to because I might want to use it for something else. I don't like wasting fabric, but I also don't like wasting my time either. I mean, who does? I'm always looking for ways to maximize my fabric and my time. That's why I'm excited about today's video sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online community for creatives, offering thousands of classes led by industry experts, designed for creatives by creatives. Skillshare has something for everyone, whether you're a seasoned pro or just starting out. They're all about learning by doing, covering everything from textiles to sewing to animation to photography, writing, and even critical skills that us creatives don't always focus on, like productivity and time management. Right now, I'm jumping into Chaos to Calm, Google Calendar workshop for creatives. Because let's be honest, as a YouTuber, time management is everything. But I've been kind of just winging it. So I'm excited to learn some tips that will level up my organization in this quick class. Plus, with their on-demand platform and lessons that build on each other, you can learn at your own pace anytime. Skillshare has classes for every level, so you can jump in no matter where you are on your creative journey. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial to Skillshare. Get started today. Thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. So what's my single most important tip for fabric cutting efficiency? Guess what? It's not this. If you want to maximize your fabric, don't cut on the fold, cut on a single layer of fabric. If you forget every other tip in this video, this is the one to remember. This is the single biggest game changer that I've found for cutting layout efficiency. Almost every pattern you purchase, whether it's vintage or modern, will show you a cutting layout on the fold of the fabric. And because I always cut on one layer, that means I pretty much usually completely ignore the cutting layouts. I guarantee you that you will be able to maximize your fabric the most when you place it on one layer. Whether you have to lay it on the floor or on a table, this is the single most important way to cut your fabric more efficiently than your pattern's cutting layout. It's also helpful if you're using a print, which I frequently do, if you want to match the print along the center back vertical seam, and I'll link you to my tutorial on how to do that in the description. You will always waste less fabric by cutting on a single layer than cutting on the fold. Now, if you're cutting out your pattern on one layer of fabric, you're pretty much on your own for figuring out where to place your pattern pieces for maximum efficiency. Take your time here, assess all of your pattern pieces, and make sure that you didn't forget anything. You don't want to go through all that and then find out after cutting, whoops, I forgot my front bodice piece. Now, particularly if you're not used to cutting on a single layer, it can help to trace an entire version of a piece that would otherwise be cut on the fold, like this back bodice. So instead of a bodice back piece that's cut on the fold, I would trace it on the fold of my tissue to have the entire bodice back piece traced out as one piece instead of just half of it. That means when I lay my fully traced pattern piece out, instead of the version on the fold, I don't have to flip it over and try and remember how much fabric it will take up. It's a nice little way to just make it a little bit easier on yourself. Along those lines, you could also cut out duplicates of any pattern piece where you need to cut out two, like leg or skirt pieces. That way you have one of every single piece you need to fit, and you can lay it all out and make absolutely certain that you have enough yardage. I did that once for a pair of plaid pants with this pattern, and I was mirroring the plaid from leg to leg, and I only had 1.5 yards of fabric. And it worked great, and I saved 1/2 yard of fabric from the recommended yardage, which was excellent since that was not cheap fabric. But if you don't want to cut out duplicates of your pattern pieces, just make sure to remember to cut out two for those pattern pieces that need it. Okay, so what if you have a big old pattern piece, like for some type of circle skirt? Depending on your size and the length of your skirt, if you're using vintage fabric, and often when you're using modern fabric, you're just not going to be able to fit your pattern piece on grain. So you have a few options to consider here. Let me get this big guy out of the way. Okay, you hang out down there for a while. First, you can add a seam allowance and a seam. If you have a large skirt piece that's meant to be cut in the fold, just add a seam allowance and cut it as 2 pieces and seam it in the middle instead. It'll be easier to fit 2 smaller pieces than 1 larger piece. Second, now let's get that really big one out again. You can take your really large pieces and cut them on the cross grain instead. So instead of cutting them on grain, you're going to cut them on the cross grain, which is probably how it would be recommended in a vintage pattern for such a large piece. Probably a modern one too. Of course, this won't work for every type of fabric or for certain directional prints, depending on how you're cutting out everything else. But if it works for your fabric, on the cross grain is a great method to try too. And third, you can piece part of your skirt. This is absolutely an acceptable way to deal with not being able to fit part of a pattern piece. In fact, it's a recommended cutting layout for many voluminous vintage skirt patterns. Usually you can't fit a bit of the lower corner, so you cut it out separately and sew it to the main pattern piece to make the correct shape. It's the reality of a narrow fabric meets a large skirt. But there are other types of pattern pieces that may not fit. It's not just skirts that may need a seam to break them up into two more reasonably sized pieces. It's also a viable option for certain types of bodices. Particularly if you have a bodice with cut-on long sleeves like this, if there's no center seam, that means the fully cut out pattern piece would be as wide as your wingspan like this, and that's for sure not going to fit on your fabric. It's wider than vintage fabric, and it's probably wider than most modern fabrics. Granted, this particular pattern piece did call for a center back seam. But if yours is meant to be cut on the fold, you can cut it on the cross grain, which your pattern will undoubtedly tell you to do. But again, you might not want to cut it on the cross grain. Due to nap or fabric print, or perhaps it's just a really fitted bodice and you know there won't be any give to it that way. Instead, just do the same thing that I mentioned for a skirt piece that's meant to be cut on the fold, add a seam allowance to the pattern piece, and then just cut two out and seam it. And last but not least, if you want to maximize your vintage fabric, you may just need to be a little bit flexible and creative. If you're using lining pieces or facing pieces that aren't going to show on the outside of your project, don't use your vintage fabric for that. Use something else like a plain modern cotton lawn. If you're sewing a dress and you can fit all of your bodice and sleeve pieces but not all of your skirt pieces, swap it out to a different skirt that uses less fabric. I do that all the time. Or if you can fit your bodice and your skirt pieces but not your sleeve pieces, go sleeveless instead. Ooh, or wait, go sleeveless, but then make a matching solid color bolero and trim that with your vintage fabric. Turn it into a great matching set. Or consider color blocking or omitting patch pockets or use contrast fabric, you name it. Now, would I order the expensive vintage fabric of my dreams if I know there's only 3 yards and my pattern calls for 4 yards? Not unless I either test out all the pattern pieces on a different fabric of 3 yards that's the same width, so I know it'll fit, or just know that if it doesn't fit, I'll happily use the fabric for something else. Try as you might, you can't always make it work. But the best part of all is if you use some of these methods, there is no risk involved. You can test this all out by laying it out on your fabric first without cutting anything. Just make sure you've accounted for all of your pattern pieces, and if they can fit on your vintage or modern fabric, fantastic. But if not, you can still save that fabric for a future project and you haven't wasted anything but a little bit of your time. Check out one of these 2 videos where I managed to squeeze my projects onto less fabric than my patterns called for, and I'll see you again soon with more vintage sewing. We are sideways. Okay, can I say?